Well, thank you for that warm welcome. Can you guys in the back of the room hear me? If you can hear me, please raise your hand. Okay. So what's the date today? November 14th. So it's a very special day in my career because exactly 36 years ago, I got my start in the industry. I got my first job at a company called Tandem Computers in Silicon Valley, and I've been there since then. So I'm officially old and over the hill, but I have a lot of stories to tell. And you'll hear about some of those stories. So to me, it's when we talk about innovation, which is and collaboration, which is one of the two key themes of this conference. Tandem is actually a very relevant story because when I joined Tandem, it was one of the top three startups in Silicon Valley in 1983. Which were the other two? Apple and Intel, right? Guess what? I mean, Tandem started in 1974 and built $1 billion in revenues per year business in 9 years. What happened to them? Do you guys know about tandem non-stop systems? How many of you guys know about tandem non-stop systems? Nobody, right? So what was their claim to fame? Their claim to fame was that in 1980, they had a computer whose mean time between failure was 10 years. What was the industry average? 1 month, right? So they built a computer that would basically run continuously. That's why they were called tandem non-stop systems. And they wrote, and essentially it was a computer that would continue to run even if any of its parts failed individually, right? That's how they got the resiliency from non-resilient components. And they rode the wave of the ATM machines because people needed cash all the time, right? So they rode the ATM machine growth and the growth in the security industry to really build a very, very rapidly $1 billion business. Where are they now? And so to me, that's part of the story, which is about innovation. They were innovators, and then they stopped innovating. And so to me, I think it's really, really important when you start thinking about innovation, how do you think about those things? Okay, so a little bit about me. So I love the outdoors. I love hiking. This is me in Chile, in Patagonia, on day 7 of the 8-day O circuit before you go over the John Gardner Pass and see the Great Glacier. And I love this, and I've done Everest Base Camp, I've done Kilimanjaro, I love the outdoors. I learned how to swim when I turned 50 so I could do a triathlon. And people who knew me in my 20s and 30s are totally amazed. Because in my starting, when I was 18 years old, I was a very committed smoker. I would smoke 2 packs a day, and you could not pay me enough to go for a walk. So what changed? Well, this is Christmas time 2004. I was at Yahoo. I was running engineering for the advertising business then, and my 4-year-old came to me, and she was trying to be nice. She wanted a nice present. She said, "Daddy, you look like Santa Claus." The rest is history. So this is my family. My wife is a psychotherapist, and she has a much more difficult job than I because software is easier than people, and particularly people who are very, very sick. And I have two lovely daughters. The one on the right is studying to be a doctor in Boston, and the younger one is actually in Maastricht, the Netherlands, for a semester. She's studying cognitive science at Berkeley, and she's here for a semester abroad. And yes, we love Mexican food. This is a picture in front of the Mexican food truck for my wife's 55th birthday. And as you can see, we don't take ourselves too seriously. This is my old. Needless to say, the younger daughter has to appear in fewer pictures than the older one, right? All right. So a little bit of what I'm going to talk about. So why innovate, right? Why do people want to innovate? And why is it difficult? And then I'm going to talk a little bit about my experience and case histories and stuff like that, and then some of the key lessons that I learned as being an executive in the industry for so many years. So, I mean, these are household names, right? Apple, Google, Amazon, LinkedIn. And when you start a company, particularly a technology company, you aspire to change the world, right? These companies have changed the world. The amazing thing about all of these companies is they have been innovators. They're innovating continuously, they're innovating at scale, right? And the other amazing thing about this is that they're all relative. when you look at the history of business, they're all relatively young companies, right? Apple is the oldest company by far here, right? When were they founded? Anyone knows? April Fool's Day, 1976, right? Guess what? The second oldest company here, Amazon, was founded 18 years later, right, in 1994, right? Google in 1998, LinkedIn in 2002. So they're all very, very young companies. They've changed the world in many different ways, right? So to me, that's the aspiring part. This is what you aspire to do when you start a technology company or you work in a technology company, because you change the world, and along with it come other good things, wealth, influence, and things that people aspire. You want people to know. And all of my friends, their kids want to go work at one of these companies because that's the brand that they like, right? I mean, it is cool. And so that's the inspiring part. There's a cautionary tale too, right? So for example, think about the companies that are not there. So when I went to Yahoo in 2004, Yahoo was one of the three big internet companies in the valley, right? Which were the other two? AOL and MSN was in Seattle, right? But essentially, those were the big three. Guess what? Both AOL and Yahoo are part of Verizon Media, right? And think about that. I mean, these companies were monster. Yahoo at one point had a market cap of 35 billion, right? And so when you think about it, the other cautionary tale here is that when you stop innovating, you cannot just rest on your laurels. You have to continue to innovate. That's one of the reasons why most of these companies are very, very committed to innovating. As Andy Grove, the CEO of Intel, said, only the paranoid survive. So these companies have a relentless need to innovate. They want to continuously innovate and disrupt themselves. Now, to answer the question that I asked you about Tandem. So here's what happened with Tandem. They built a monster business, and the system was very, very differentiated. But as other computers started becoming more and more reliable, the differentiation started to erode. No one was willing to pay 5 times the price to buy a computer that was continuously available. So guess what they needed to do? They needed to figure out how to build computers that were more cost-effective, right? And eventually, what ended up happening is they could not innovate fast enough, and now they're a part of HP, right? So one of the things that's important is, I think this is unique to software and technology more than other businesses, which is you just simply cannot rest on your laurels, right? So if you think about companies like MySpace, I mean, they were big in 2005. They were one of the top 3 social networks, right? Guess what? They no longer exist. Why? Facebook ate them for lunch, right? And so the important thing is that you really have to be on your toes. And so, having lived in Silicon Valley for the last 36 years, one of the things I can tell you is that you never, ever, ever, ever rest on your laurels. You have to continue to innovate. And that's the relentless drive that I see in entrepreneurs. Okay, so what are some of the things that I learned about scaling product teams and scaling product innovation? So one of the first things is, okay, and I think this is relevant to this discussion because I trained as a performance engineer. I did my graduate work in performance engineering, and my first job at Tandem was that as a performance engineer. So even though I pretend to be an executive, I'm at heart a performance engineer. So whenever I see problems of scale, I always think about how you solve them from a performance engineering perspective. So one of the core things that you want to do when you are trying to scale teams and innovate is you want to do more things in parallel. And obviously, one of the core issues that you run into is if you have a monolithic technology architecture, which most initial startups do, then you essentially, that gets in the way because it creates dependencies between different teams and makes it very, very hard for them to be independent of each other and essentially slows down the velocity of innovation. The teams keep trampling over each other's code and things like that, right? And that's a problem that I've had to solve with our teams, both at LinkedIn and at LeanPlum, because there was, the core thing is when you start a startup company, you want to solve for innovation velocity to find your product market fit, right? So typically, the startup architecture tends to be, you basically have a you have a single database, you have a monolithic backend, and you have a monolithic front end. Why? because you want all information at your fingertips. You do not want to create a new service point to go make a call to create a function because it slows you down. So the basic idea is you want to solve for innovating at no or low scale, right? And the architectures that really, really work well with that kind of a problem are monolithic architectures. So typically, the canonical problem that I've seen over and over and over again in my career is that you essentially have a startup, and they really try lots and lots of different things, and particularly when you start looking at the space concerning consumers, unlike the enterprise, there is no science. It's art. So you don't know what's going to work. You have to try lots of things, and that's how you learn. And the fastest way to learn is by having a monolithic architecture. Guess what? When your startup catches fire, you're in trouble because then you cannot really scale fast enough. So having a monolithic technology architecture is obviously an issue. The second key thing is that typically startups have one product, right? And product is, the different parts of the product are very, very interrelated. So for example, when I was at Yahoo, the reporting obviously was really interrelated to the ad server and the campaign management stuff, right? At LinkedIn, essentially the homepage had lots of interdependencies on lots of other things. So typically what ends up happening is you have functional dependencies between different components of the product, and that creates issues in challenging, in scaling product innovation. And the final one, which we see increasingly now, is that you have globally distributed teams. And pretty much every large company that I have worked at, I've had teams at several different locations, right? So why? And the reason is because there is a war for talent. There is a war for talent, and so you want to find a critical mass of talent where you can. And particularly in the software industry, I mean, the Valley is a brutal place to hire and keep talent. So people go elsewhere. And then essentially, some of the reasons why, other reasons why people want to find talent in different locations is because it may be more cost effective. Or they may have skills and orientation that are not available elsewhere. Or they may have an unfair advantage in a certain location because they have a better and different brand, right? And so, for example, one of the core things that I love about Sophia, so by the way, this is my 4th visit to Sophia in the last 2 years, and I'm very happy to let you guys know that I have been here in every season of the year. And it is a warm and welcoming city, and my first visit was in February of 2018. And I give a lot of talks when I come here, and it's amazing to me the growth in interest and talent that I see in the software industry just in that brief amount of time. It just feels to me that I saw some of the talent, explosion in talent in Bangalore and some of the other global centers. It feels like we are at the beginning of something very, very special. And you guys are the pioneers. And so the thing that I see is that in Sophia, what's special about the engineers and product people that I work with at Sophia? They want to build beautiful things. They really want to build things that are high quality, that scale, that always work. That's what I learned as a systems engineer at Tandem in my first job. That's what makes companies successful. And so I feel that as we look out 10 to 15 years from now and we look back, I think that the next few years are going to be very, very foundational in terms of what Sophia is able to contribute to the world economy, particularly with software, and I would say within that, products and products that really require scalable, high quality, always on engineering, because I revere the talent that I work with here, and the talent that we have at Leanplum is great, but the talent, I mean the people who I meet when I do talks is amazing. I'm inspired by how people think, their dedication, their quality consciousness, and things like that. And I realized that ISTA started as a quality and testing focused conference, and it's morphed into in a broader technology frame. But I want you guys to know, I mean, the thing that's really special about Sophia is that people care about quality. They want to build great things. And I think, to me, that's a great foundation upon which to build. So one of the reasons why I think the global teams in Sophia would grow and grow very, very rapidly is because, I mean, you'd be crazy not to consider it. Because in this incarnation of my career, I work with a lot with small to medium scale startups who are looking for investments. Because I work with investors to assess technology companies. And I'd say just in the last year, I've met like 3 companies that wanted an introduction to somebody in Sofia because they wanted to set up a team over here. And I was like, wow. I mean, and these are not huge companies, they're small companies. And they're willing to take a risk because you guys are building that reputation. And so to me, it's very heartwarming to see that. But one of the things that comes with it is the the cultural differences, the time differences, and just having globally distributed teams is hard, right? And so, and we learned a fair amount about how to work with globally distributed teams, and I'm happy to share some of those lessons with you guys. Okay, so I'm going to try and take you through a few phases of the most recent company that I worked at, which is LeanPlum, to show you what we learned and some of the mistakes we made and some of the errors that we corrected over time, just to give you a sense of how this journey looks like. So in the early stages of LeanPlum, so LeanPlum was founded in 2012, right? It's a 7-year-old company, and they've grown very, very rapidly. They are installed on 1 billion phones. We do about 25 billion events a day. So it's decent scale. We are one of Google Cloud's largest customers. So they've grown, and they've grown very, very rapidly, right? And in the early days, essentially, we had teams in San Francisco and Sofia. Why Sofia? One of our co-founders is Bulgarian, Momchil. So that was the reason why we had a team in Sofia, right? We had a flat structure, so we had basically a manager in Sofia, we had a manager in San Francisco, everyone reported up to that person, right? In terms of goal setting and work management, essentially Momchil figured out what needed to be done, right? The CEO or the head of product, and essentially was top-down prioritization, and then we had a very informal Scrum process to really organize the work, right? And in approaches to technology, as I said, one of the things we did was we really, really relied heavily on the Google managed services, App Engine, Data Store, for 2 reasons. The first one was that both the founders had worked at Google, right? So they were familiar with Google technologies. And the second reason was Google gave the company a deal that was hard to say no to, right? And finally, it was a monolithic architecture, like all product market fit companies. And today, it's like, I want to figure out how to, change this, that, or the other. I want to get that customer. And if you think about it, LeanPlum was really started life as an A/B testing company, selling a A/B testing or a multivariate testing product to product managers, and then very quickly realized that messaging was far more valuable, right? And they became a messaging company, and they successfully did multiple pivots to really get growth to the next level, and they were able to do it very, very quickly, right? Because they essentially all the information that engineers needed was in one place. Okay, so what are the things we learned? The first thing we learned is that this team at small scale could innovate really, really, really fast. And it was impressive to watch that, right? The second thing was there was this common sense of mission. Everyone was in the same boat, right? There was a big, and we had rituals. There was a big gong in the office, and every time anything happened that was substantial, you'll ring the gong, and everyone in the office could hear that, hey, something happened, what happened, right? So it basically made it much easier to get the team excited about whatever the new urgent project was, right? And then, of course, everyone worked on whatever was the most important, so there was no resource fragmentation. So where's the trouble in paradise, right? So the first one was everyone worked on everything. So essentially, there was no ownership of code. I mean, people would, the goal was to finish some feature, right? And people would just take the code, hack it up, because they really did not understand. So when we started looking at that code, they had layers of inefficiencies because people are afraid to touch the code to clean it up because they were worried they'd break something because they did not understand it enough. There was not enough of the power of specialization, right? So we essentially ended up creating a lot of technical debt, right? And the product became harder and harder and less efficient to evolve over time. And then, we had a team in Sofia, we had a team in San Francisco. There's a 10-hour time difference. It was really difficult to keep the 2 teams together. They'll, step on each other's code. The check-ins were not getting updated, reviewed on time. It was a bunch of issues with communication. So we realized fairly quickly that, well, this is not going to scale, right? And since the company was growing rapidly, we needed to find a new solution. So this is the first thing we tried beyond the product market fit. We basically created teams of 5 to 9 people. Now, each of these teams had a leader. It had a product manager. Optionally, it would have a UX designer. We did not have a lot of designers, and each team did not need a full UX designer, but there was a UX designer for many of these teams. And then essentially at 4 to 7 software engineers, and it was essentially some front end and some back end. So the idea was this is a team that could be fed with 2 pizzas, right? We did not want a team that had more people than could be fed with 2 pizzas, right? And it was autonomous. So we basically told the pod leads, you are CEO, this is your startup. Operate at startup speed. Think like you're a startup, right? So each of these teams are really, really autonomous, right? The second thing was we had a rule. There would be no one on the team that would be offsite. So we did not want some members of the team in Sofia and some members of the team in San Francisco. We essentially, each team had all its members in one location. They needed to be, and in fact, we put them in the same physical space close to each other because their boards and, like all of the things that they were doing were essentially in one small area. And then essentially so how did we organize the teams? There was a team for campaign creation and orchestration. There was a team for the SDKs. There was a team for reporting. So we essentially took different functional areas and we essentially gave it to each of the teams. So they were very, very independent from that perspective. They controlled the backlog. They would go talk to customers, figure out what needed to be done, and they would essentially manage their own backlog. So they were really, really independent, right? And then the accountability was at a team level. So what we tried to do was to say the team succeeds or fails as a unit, right? And this was important because one of the things that we wanted to do was to create this concept that you are a startup of your own, right? And the way we would ensure that people would really step up is peer reviews within the team. So if you're not pulling your weight, your peers would basically tell you you are not pulling your weight, and that would be part of your performance appraisal, right? Okay, so the teams were great about what to do, right? The thing that we complemented that with were things we called chapters. So what we essentially did was we had a chapter for each area. So for example, for pod leadership, there was a pod development leadership chapter. For product managers, there was a product manager chapter. For designers, there was a designers chapter. And then for tech leads, we had lots of chapters like front end, back end, DevOps. And basically the idea was that each chapter was a group of experts with a leader. Now, the leader was not a manager, unlike the pod lead, where everyone reported to the. So this is not a CEO, this is a guru, right? This is a person who people revere, who they look up to and say, Peter, how do we do, this database design? Can you come help me with that? So these are people who are role models, right? And they would align around best practices. The idea is, this was about how do you do this thing in a nice, consistent way, right? And the idea was it enabled the pods by providing best practices. In many cases, for example, what we would do is if many pods were trying to do the same thing, then we would essentially, the chapters would create a work product that they could use, right? So for example, you're trying to move to Kubernetes, they would create a blueprint for a Kubernetes thing. Or if you're trying to do a design paradigm for front end, then they would essentially create a prototype that other people could clone, and things like that, right? So essentially, so this was a difficult change for the organization, right? Because it was a materially different way of working. So guess what we did? We got everyone, all of our people, the prod dev people in the same location, and we did what's called a pod conference. So we had a PodCon. We essentially created a lot of artifacts. We trained everyone on this thing. We trained everyone on the formal Scrum methodology and stuff like that, right? And so the way these teams operated was, we would essentially do goal setting on a quarterly basis, right? So prod dev leadership would create organizational level goals, and then each of the pods would create their own OKRs using those goals. And what we would do is the pods would get 3 levels of feedback. The first round of feedback was with the leadership of product development. Like to say, do these goals make sense? The second level of feedback was with all of the stakeholders in the entire company. And the third level of feedback was with the other pods, right? So the idea was you try and align it so that, you'd essentially have a reasonable set of goals, right? And then we would in the middle of the quarter, we would do a review to make sure that things were going well, whether we needed adjustments or not. And at the end of the quarter, we would essentially review the results, and the pod with the best effort would get a prize, which is like everyone on the pod would get to go out, and it was modest budget of like $1,000 per person. But for example, one of our pods in Sofia, they went to Greece because it's like cost effective to go to Greece from here, right? So it made sense, right? And then we had biweekly sprints, so each of the pods controlled their own backlog. It was a classic Scrum process, and then we would have a biweekly Scrum of Scrums to essentially talk about organizational issues, blockers, and things like that. And from a technology perspective, we started the process of migrating from managed services, which I still have scars from that. And then, of course, we're trying to make the code more modular, right? So that essentially was the setup. So how did we do? So the thing that we loved was, it was amazing for me to watch that teams are so engaged and motivated. So one of the core things that it did is each team was independent. So we had teams in Sofia, we had teams in San Francisco, and most of the communication was within the team. The cross-team communication was very nicely and organized in a structured way. So, and these teams had a ton of ownership. People would get upset if someone else modified, if a member from another team modified their code. So we actually put in rules in place that required approval from the code owners of a particular area before you could change their code, right? So these teams are really, really motivated. And what we found is that we saw them harness the power of innovation because they got progressively more specialized. They got very, very deep into each of the areas, and so they could move really fast. And they could really innovate in their product area. So it was very nice to watch that. And finally, we realized this was a model that could scale, because what we had done is we had scaled it in San Francisco and Sofia, and if you wanted to set up offices in other locations, this was a blueprint that would work well, because essentially what it did was it essentially made each site a peer, which was the beautiful thing about this model was that unlike many of the organizations that I had managed at Yahoo and companies prior to that, the organizations that were not at headquarters always felt that they were not considered important enough, right? Here, each organization was important, equally important, right? You're a startup of 7 people, and you had a CEO, and you could be anywhere. So the whole basic idea was you were empowered, you were making decisions, and you would rise and fall on those decisions. And so what it did is essentially it created organizations that were true peers, which I believe is the model that would succeed in this new era of global teams, which is each team needs to be a standalone, equally powerful, equally specialized in some other area. Don't try and do it for cost reasons. Do it because you want to create these teams that can grow independently, because that gives you a lot of latitude and flexibility in terms of how you grow the teams. So what were the problems that we ran into? Well, the first one was that we told the pod leads that they were CEOs, and they took it literally. So I was like, hey, we don't need to, we have our own business to manage. It's like there's something else happened. They did not care much about what other teams are doing. They were like, these are my assets, these are my goals. I'm going to make sure that I do the right thing here, because that's what they were being judged on. And so they literally were, it was a good thing and it was a bad thing, right? So anything that required cross-pod coordination was painful to do. And the reason is, and clearly, these are different parts of the same product, right? They're not independent products. It's like, oh, I need a new feature here, it needs reporting. The reporting guy would say, not on my priority list, right? So we had to basically figure out a way to, this was not good. We had to figure out a way to make it more efficient. So that was one huge challenge. The second challenge was, and this was a perennial challenge, which is the work would not be equal in all teams, right? So this issue would be, there was work in team A, and there were people in team B. But the people are permanently bound to these teams. So there was too much fragmentation, right? Because this was like team A is dying and team B is like the designer saying, I don't have anything to do, right? And so to me, they were underutilized. So that was another key problem that we had to solve. So to me, one of the core lessons in all of this is when you try new things, you get some good things, you get some bad things, and they're all compromises and they work at different stages. So nothing's perfect, right? And the third one was actually the thing that was also very, very troubling, which was essentially that each of these pods were totally independent. And so you'd have a bug come in from the field organization, and the SDK guys would say, not in my pod. So the bug would bounce around between different teams. And it drove the support organization crazy. It's like, no, I don't want to deal with like 7 different leads. Tell me, I mean, give it to engineering, let them figure it out. Like, so to me, that was one issue. The second issue was whenever we would do the goals review with the broader stakeholders within the company, each of the pods would present their stuff, and then the business guys would say, so how does this relate to that? It was very fragmented. So it was very hard for the team, for the external teams to figure out, what was being done cohesively, because it was not really very well organized. So we realized that from a totally centralized way, going to a totally decentralized way was going too far, right? Because there needed to be something in between. And so, to me, one of the key things that we learned from that was that these are some of the things that we needed to change. So guess what we did? We created, so after watching this for a few months, actually almost a year, we created domains. So what are domains? Domains are essentially a set of pods with a domain product lead and a domain technical lead, right? And essentially a manager for the domain. So the idea was, they are related pods, and there is a formal leader. So this was a manager of these people. So the domain lead would actually be would manage each of the pod leads in that domain, and the domain product lead and the domain technical lead. So this person was a single-threaded leader. So then we could tell the support organization, hey, if you have a problem with the reporting stuff, go there. If you have a problem with like all of the campaign or SDK stuff, go here. And we have people whose job it was to figure out how to make these cohesive, how to resolve conflict across different teams and stuff like that. And then essentially, these things were aligned, the pod leads were responsible for aligning things around common goals because they essentially had that responsibility. So it was more cohesive. We could tell Vasil, please, go meet Vasil to talk about what all of the things we are doing related to audiences and reporting and all those areas is, because he could actually talk about those and you could figure out why are we doing what we are doing and how does it make sense and things like that, right? And finally, to reduce the fragmentation problem, what we did was we had allocated a few senior domain resources, senior engineers, who could actually be bound to any pod for a brief amount of time. So if a pod A had too much work and they were dying, they'd get a domain resource. And the idea was these were super senior people, right? And when they worked in a pod, they were part of the pod, so they needed to follow all the rules for the pod, which is you're modifying someone else's code, it needs to be code reviewed, you need to follow their standards, and things like that. So essentially, and the pod, because the pod would take over the responsibility of maintaining and supporting whatever artifacts came out of this, right? So how did the domain model work out? Well, it's still work in progress, so it's too early to assess, but there have been some improvements and there are more things that we need to work, and I hope to come back here at a later time and share the next part of this journey. So what are some of the things I learned? So the first one is that create small and independent cross-functional teams. I think to me, it was non-obvious every time I've done it how powerful they are, because to me, the incentives there and the motivation there is astounding. People do amazing things once they know they're independent, that they have a mission, they're accountable for that mission, and they're going to be successful. So to me, you get a very different level of commitment and energy. It's literally like having a small startup, right? People were working incredibly hard and they were doing incredible things because they felt like this is what they own and they were accountable for it, right? The second thing that I learned is, and I wouldn't, and this is a combination of my experience at LinkedIn and Lean Plum, is that I would say scale at one location before you expand. I think one of the, because we essentially inherited these teams at that point when we were trying to parallelize them, but at LinkedIn, I'd gone there right after Yahoo, and Reid Hoffman, who was the founder and my counterpart in product, he said, should we have an offsite? Should we have an offshore team? It was a standard thing to do in the Valley in 2007. And I said, no, I do not want an offshore team. I want everyone on the same floor, on the same side of the same floor, in the same building, right? Because one of the things that I learned through my experience in previous jobs is distributed teams are hard, right? And essentially, that's the script that LinkedIn followed, which is we essentially created parallel teams. We figured out how to make them work really well, and then we expanded to different locations. So I would say, if you have a choice, try and do it in one location because it's much easier to figure out how to fix a lot of these things. I think the other thing that we've learned, that I've learned consistently in so many jobs, is that you must have a strong site leader at each location. Uh, Pretty much every single time I've tried to create a team in a location without a strong leader, I have failed. Period. Right? And so one of the things like that I have learned over time is that it just doesn't work. So I advise a lot of startups, and in my current business, I assess that company. They always say, "Oh, I have two guys in South Carolina, and should I hire them?" I said, "No. If you need a regional manager before you hire people, right? Can't they work out of the house? And I mean, I'm dying for engineers in San Francisco. No, because you'll hire them now, then they'll be gone in 6 months. What are you going to do, right? And so, to me, I think that's one of the very, very key lessons, that each site must have a strong leader. I think people underestimate the importance of modular and scalable technology architecture, right? So, for example, one of the core things, that problems that we had when we tried to scale, when I got to LinkedIn, we had essentially had one big team, and we would do a systems release every month, and we would do a feature release every month, right? Alternate month. So we'd get a feature, each of these releases every alternate month, and we essentially created 6 parallel teams, and they were releasing every week, right? And guess what was the biggest bottleneck? It was that the build system was not modular. We had so many unit tests, they'd run for 18 hours. And so from the time team A got done to the time team B needed to go, it was like, oh my God, we don't have enough time. And so one of the things that you have to do is to modularize the technology, because if you don't do that, it's not going to work. And finally, you have to pay attention to people who you serve in the company, because I think we guys, there's a lot of engineers and product people in this room, right? So, we always have this inside-out mentality, right? It's like, we are not the center of the universe. We serve as part of a larger organization. And one of the core things that you have to do when you go through these transformations is, if you think this is hard for you, it's actually much harder for the rest of the organization to deal with you, right? And with all the leaders with this different orientation. So it's very, very important to pay attention to external stakeholders as you're going through this transformation. And then again, I want to close by saying that I predict, given what I see here, that like in 10 to 15 years, there's going to be 10 times more engineers in Sofia than there are now, and it would be considered a world-class premium location to do business. And it would not be because it would be low cost. It would be lower cost, somewhat lower cost, and it would be because people would revere the talent they can get here.
We have time for a couple of questions. Anybody would have the guts to ask something? Okay.
Hello, thank you for the lecture. In few places you mentioned that it is very critical to have good leaders for the teams. How do you find such people? How do you develop their qualities? And how do you make sure that only the appropriate people with the certain soft and hard skills are actually put in such responsible positions? Because your success is actually hanging on this as well.
Yes, great question. So the question is essentially, how do you find the right leaders, right? So one of the core things, I think, to me, the tricky part, so it's tricky to hire the leader. So one of the things that I always advise people is that much easier to start with the leader and have them hire the rest of the team, right? So that's the first part. And typically, you find leaders through your network. You do not find leaders, they don't come out of the woodwork. It's very scary to have a very large site in a faraway place and trust it to a leader who you don't know well, right? You need that comfort level. So typically, it would be a person who knows somebody who you know, or ideally multiple people would have references to this. So it's a personal connection. And particularly in some areas of the globe where there's a large number of software engineers, Bulgarians have very high level of ethics. Usually you don't, systems work well, you don't have a lot of fraud, things like that. But there are areas, of the world where the business climate is not as ethical. So when you are trying to set up teams there, you really need someone who you can trust. So basically you need two things. You need a person who's good or great, and you need a person who you can trust, right? And typically you find these people through your network. And that's essentially the algorithm that we follow. And typically what I found is that when you try and have a small team and then find a leader for them, it seldom works because either the leader or the team members end up having an allergic reaction to each other. So it creates the situation where you end up undoing things that you have done.
Oh. There is one more.
And one of the things that I want to say as a corollary to this is, you guys in this room is the brain trust that would create, you would rise to those leadership positions in Sophia as you progress in your career, right? So one of the important things that I see is, so I would say, for you guys, my advice would be find the right mentorship. Find the right coaches to help you and coach you and guide you through that next phases of your career, because in 5 years or 10, when that next big opportunity from a startup that you have not even heard about right now comes, which it would, the next WhatsApp, and then you want to be the person who is essentially has the network to get that nod. So two things: A, build your skills, and B, build your network, because and I think that's the old adage, which is in your 20s and 30s, you are valuable for how smart you are and what you can do. In your 40s, you are valuable for who you know and what they think of you.
Hello. One question from me here. Okay.
Yes.
Just out of curiosity, you mentioned you have domain leaders, team leaders, chapter leaders, etc. Do you think the leadership overhead is too much, and have you tried any other ways of handling multiple teams across different locations?
I think I did not hear all of the question, but I think the gist is, are you asking, with so many leaders, are there too many leaders and too many layers of leadership?
Yeah.
I think typically what you would find is that that's a good question. And I think, because in some ways what you'd find is that the teams are getting more flat now, right? A lot of my friends who are middle managers in Silicon Valley for many years do not have jobs. And the reason is because middle management jobs have reduced dramatically. But I think what you'd find is that there's a difference between leaders and managers. So the important thing is it's not a hierarchy, right? So in this hierarchy, you essentially have pod leads who are managers, and then domain leads who are managing pod leads. The rest of the people are senior technical or senior product people, right? So they provide leadership at a different level. They provide leadership by influence. So one way to think about it is that it's bad if you have a very deep hierarchy. It's good if you essentially have people, you provide people an opportunity to lead their peers based upon becoming role models and self-respect, right? Because if you think about it, or peer respect, because if you think about it, a lot of you guys in the audience, you guys are technical people, and as you rise in your career, many of you would not want to manage, but you want influence. How do you get influence, and how do you get leverage? You get those things by influencing other people and really inspiring other people to follow your lead and follow what you say. And that's what the whole discipline of senior technical leadership and architecture leadership is about. It is about essentially, creating these people who can say, follow me because this is the right way to do things, and you convince people that this is the right way to do things.
Once again, applause for Anil.
Okay. Thank you. Thanks a lot.
It was great.
Thanks.